This episode of the USM podcast is brought to you by our partners Midwest Sim Racing, Vibes Custom Products, K&M Barbecue, and everybody else. We thank you all for your support. So, I'm Reed, and you can see Steve Dango Legs here, and it's just us two.
Yeah, this is a little different. It's
Yeah.
usually Wednesday nights.
Yeah, and also it's Thursday, which is weird. But
Yeah, it feels a little weird. Not gonna
so
lie.
John Swamp Donkey couldn't be here, unfortunately, due to some family stuff. But yeah, we pre-recorded the interview with him earlier. Me, JP, Steve, John, Joey, we were all there. Plus our friends CJ from Midwest Sim Racing. He joined in on the fun. He got to talk to Larry Mack a bit. So it was fun earlier when we were recording, but we'll show the video later on here in a few minutes. But besides that, it's going to be a little different this week. We're not doing the whole usual layout where we talk about racing and then usually baseball and football, basketball and hockey, whatever. We're showing the video from earlier because it's about 40 minutes long.
When we said story time with Larry Mack, we really meant story time with Larry Mack.
Yeah.
That's this dedicated this whole episode, and you guys
this whole
are in for a
episode is
treat.
just story time with Larry Mack. So
and there's some funny stories in here. So
yeah,
we laughed pretty hard during all this. You'll see it, obviously.
Larry Mack just casually roasting the crap out of a Tennessee fan.
That was a good one.
So, but anyways, it was fun, and give me 1 second to type in our Discord here.
Oh yeah, speaking of our Discord, we do have a Discord if you guys are interested. You can find it posted on the USM and URN Facebook. Hopefully, it's already been posted. I made the graphic. Maybe it's posted. I don't know.
Here, I'll post it after the stream.
Okay, there we go.
You'll be able to go and find it if you want to join us and engage in the shit postery. So,
also, don't forget that we have 2 pages technically. That's USM and URN. So please follow both of those. Find us on Spotify under Ungovernable Sports Media. We're everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify. Yep. The only thing we're not on is Apple Music because honestly, that's expensive to put your stuff on.
Yeah, Spotify is much better. Much better.
Oh, yeah.
But anyways, I guess without further ado, we'll get to showing our story time segment with Larry Mack, and we'll see you on the other side of that. So, on today's episode of the USM podcast, we're joined by somebody who needs no introduction, America's crew chief, Larry McReynolds. Thank you for being here.
Oh, appreciate you guys having me. Looking forward to it.
So, I believe, Steve, you have the first question.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mack, how's it going, first of all?
It's going great. Hope you are as well.
Yes, sir. Let's go ahead and get this started. How many organizations have you been with in your career?
Oh, as far as race teams, I'm going to have to do some really quick math. I want to say probably about 6. There seemed to be a lot of them in the early going of my career, like in the early 80s. But then in 1986, when I joined Kenny Bernstein and King Racing, that was a 26 car. I was there from 86 through 90. And then 91 through 96 with Robert Yates Racing. And then 97 through my last year as a crew chief, 2000 with Richard Childers. So a number in the early going, but I guess the last 14 or 15 years of my career, it was only 3.
Joey?
All right. So tell us how it was working with Dale Sr. and what his legacy just means to you and to the entire sport.
Well, I think even though it was over 20-something years ago that we lost Dale Earnhardt Sr., I think we're still feeling the effect today. I tell people all the time, excuse me, that when we lost Dale Earnhardt in February of 2001, it was kind of like when rock and roll lost Elvis Presley. When Elvis Presley passed away, rock and roll music didn't stop, but it changed, and it's still different today. And I think the same hold true for Dale Earnhardt when we lost him in that final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500. NASCAR didn't stop. We went right to Rockingham the next week and raced, but it's just been different. He was the voice of NASCAR. He was our Elvis Presley. And, to be able to work with him for 2 years, we didn't have quite the success I think that either one of us anticipated. The good news is we did get that 1998 Daytona 500, which I know certainly was huge for me, but I know how huge it was for Dale Earnhardt, all of his fans, Richard Childress Racing. But I would say the mark he left on the sport is a mark that we still feel today. He put a whole new meaning to what I would call the blue collar racer. He was that guy that I think everybody could relate to, that people wanted to hang out with. They wanted to maybe sit down and have a beer with him. He was just kind of the all-American guy, the blue-collar worker that went racing on the weekend, if you might say.
Steve?
All right, Mr. Mack. I'm curious. I think everybody is curious. What is the craziest modification you've ever done to get past NASCAR Tech? If you can tell us that, of course.
Oh, wow. That's probably a longer list than we've got.
I love it.
So before we went to Cal induction, where basically the air goes in that rectangular hole at the base of the windshield and it would feed air to the air cleaner where the carburetor was. We eventually went to Cal induction, where basically all the air that went through that hole is forced into the air cleaner. But back in the 80s, even early 90s, it was not. There was a big space between that Cal and the air cleaner. And we would work feverishly testing at the wind tunnel, trying to make that just as efficient as we could, because the more air we could get to transfer down through that Cal and into that air cleaner, that's horsepower, especially at a place like Daytona and Talladega, especially once we started running the carburetor restrictor plate. So I kind of came up, I'll say we came up with a deal where there was a lever on the dash that it almost looked like a brake bias lever. But what it was, he could push that lever, and once the hood was closed and the driver was out on the racetrack, it actually slid a panel out from that Cal that sealed the Cal to the air cleaner. And then, of course, when the race was over or qualifying was over, he would just pull that lever back and that thing would retract back into the Cal. Never did get caught with it. But eventually we went to straight Cal induction, so it was kind of a moot point. Probably the other thing that we did, but we got cold feet and we never raced it, we would run tape on the grill, because that was like a big aero advantage. And I'm talking mainly Daytona and Talladega. The more tape you put on that grill, the faster it would go. It was like reducing the drag. And so it's kind of one of those deals where if you're out front, you can run more tape. If you're back in the pack in traffic, you needed less tape, but obviously you can't change it. So we had a company design a radiator that had a temperature sensor on it that almost like when the temperature would get so high, louvers would open up on that radiator and let more air into it. And as the temperature would go down, those louvers would start closing, which effectively was the same as putting tape on the nose. But we tested it. It worked well, but we just got cold feet and said, what if something malfunctions with this thing in the race? Not necessarily worried so much about NASCAR catching it, but what if it malfunctions? And the Daytona 500, we pretty much beat ourselves, or maybe what you might say, out trick ourselves. So we got cold feet and didn't use it. So that's a couple of things that jumps to mind.
Joey?
All right. So what do you think has been your career defining moment? Like either winning that 98 500 with Dale or being at the Fox booth. What do you think is your most defining moment of all time?
Well, I've got to believe it was, winning the Daytona 500s. I was able to win the first one in 1992 with Davey Allison, the 28 car in Robert Yates Racing, and then came back 6 years and was able to win it with Dale. That one probably goes to the top of the sheet, not necessarily for me because they both are very special, but it's amazing. Here we are, 25 years later, 26 years later, and I still get introduced as two-time Daytona 500 winning crew chief Larry McReynolds. I'll have fans come up to me still today and go, "You're the man. You're the one that got Dale Earnhardt that Daytona 500 win." And that's very flattering when they say it, but I just happened to be the lucky guy in place when he didn't have the flat tire in the last corner of the last lap. He didn't run out of fuel. He didn't hit a seagull on the back straightaway. All the things that happened to him in that 3 car trying to get that win, I just happened to be the guy that was in place when it all came together. But I would say winning those 2 Daytona 500s, because I think when you win a Daytona 500, it doesn't stay with you the rest of the year. It doesn't stay with you the rest of your career. It realistically stays with you the rest of your life.
So next thing got for you. So I have a question, and our friend CJ here is going to add on to my question. So as an Alabama fan, how do you feel? I mean, we're a sports podcast. We got to talk about sports every now and then. So how do you feel about Alabama going into this year? And CJ, I believe you had another question related to Alabama football you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I'll ask him whenever he gets done answering your question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've probably learned the hard way. I'm a very intense Alabama Crimson Tide fan.
Roll Tide.
And to know the players that we lost last year, Bryce Young, most notably, Will Anderson, the linebacker, they're probably both going to go very early in the first round later on tonight. Hopefully Bryce Young comes to the Carolina Panthers. But to lose our 2 coordinators, lost Bill O'Brien, our offensive coordinator, Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator, that's a lot of hits. But I have learned over time that just when you're really nervous about where they may be, Nick Saban figures it out. I hear they had a great recruiting. The spring training was good. The A-Day game was good this past, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So we'll just have to see. I'm still not sure we're going to be back to where they were 4 or 5 years ago. But if I was a betting man, I'd say they're probably going to be pretty competitive. But Georgia obviously is making a claim to be the top dog in the SEC, no doubt.
Larry, I want to start off with Bud. It's an honor to meet you and privilege to talk to you, man. I just got one question I want to ask you here before I start driving again.
Sure.
What did it feel like when the Big Orange beat the
Well, I guess the last time that Tennessee beat Alabama prior to this year, I was learning how to spell my name. So it has kind of been a while. But, honestly, I was pretty impressed with Tennessee this year. That coach, he's come in there and done miracles with that team. But, I mean, he did the same thing with UFC.
Yep.
So, again, it's been a long time. I think the numbers was up in the thousands and thousands of days since it last happened. But
15 years.
Yeah, so it had been a while. But, to lose to Tennessee and LSU both, and remember, I think both losses was essentially a last play of the game loss. Win, ever how you want to look at it. But pretty impressed with what that guy's done at Tennessee in a short time.
Thank you, Larry.
Yes, sir.
So, Steve, you got something?
Yes. So, who gave you the title America's Crew Chief? I've always wondered that.
Well, it's a strange story. It was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and we started a new season with Fox and FS1, and I do a lot of studio stuff with Adam Alexander. We do Race Hub together basically every Monday night. We'll do a race day pre-race show in the second half every Sunday, Adam, Jamie McMurray, and myself. And just out of the clear blue, is we came on the air with a race up show. He introduced me as America's crew chief, Larry McReynolds. And I, to myself, I kind of went, where did that come from? But it was one of those deals where he said it and he kept saying it, and it just stuck. It's very, very flattering, but that's where it stimulated was, or where it came from, originated was Adam Alexander.
I think we all agree with you are America's crew chief. We love you.
Yes,
I mean-
we 100% agree with that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Do you give any advice to your son-in-law Jordan Anderson on?
John's having audio
Oh
issues.
no! Oh no!
My bad. Do you give any advice to Jordan, your son-in-law, on his racing career, or have you so far?
You know, whether it's Jordan, my son-in-law Jordan Anderson, or my son Brandon McReynolds, of course, Brandon's no longer racing, but he's still heavily involved in NASCAR. He spots for Ross Chastain in the Cup Series. He spots for Parker Kligerman in Xfinity. He works with Doug Yates on a company called Clear 28 Agency, and they basically manage Noah Gregson. They manage Cole Custer. They do some stuff with Chase Briscoe. But I'm not the meddling dad or the meddling father-in-law. They all know that I'm here, and that if you want to hear my opinion, if you want my advice, if you want to lean on me, I'm here. Now, if you're looking for just an answer you want to hear, I might not be your guy, because I'm not going to be an ear massager. I'm going to tell you exactly what I feel. But yeah, Jordan and I have had a lot of conversations, especially before he ventured into the Xfinity Series. Again, it's not a deal where I go up there and start roaming through the shop and go, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. But if he asks, and he will periodically, he knows that I'm certainly here for him.
Were you ever at any point, or have you thought about being a crew chief to Brandon in any sort of series?
Well, again, Brandon's pretty much, I think, his driving career, that ship has finally sailed, you know, with being in his early 30s now, and it's been a while. And, you know, we never quit trying to climb that vertical mountain, but I think we just finally reached a point where, you know, we're just not going to be able to find the funding. And of course, it doesn't matter how talented you are or what you've accomplished, if you don't walk through these doors of a truck team or Xfinity Series team with a check stuck between your teeth, it's not going to happen. But, you know, I did look after his racing in the early years when he ran Bandolero, when he ran Allison Legacy. The first year he ran the UARA late model, but I think it finally reached a fork in the road, and we were fortunate enough to have good enough sponsors that I felt like with everything else I was trying to do, I was maybe spreading myself a little bit too thin, and that we probably need to hire someone, and that we hired a guy by the name of Nick Hutchins his second year in the UARA series, and it was a game changer because I think, one, it's tough being your son's crew chief. You know, I could tell him something that I was feeling or seeing, and he'd kind of brush it off, and someone else could come along 5 minutes later and tell him the same thing, and he'd take it in hook, line, and sinker. It's like, I just told you that. And I think it's because of the dad deal. But, yeah, he won 5 or 6 races that year and came close to winning the championship. But, you know, I always enjoyed it. But I think sometimes as a dad, it can really be tough being your son's crew chief.
John?
If any team called, would you ever go back to being a full-time crew chief, and what team would it be?
Yeah, I honestly think after being off the box for 23 years, that ship has probably sailed. Now, I tell people all the time that I think I could go back today and call a race from a standpoint of strategy on the pit box during the race. I think I could maybe call a race as good or better than when I was actually a crew chief, just because of what I've learned and what I've seen over the last 23 years from a different view. Now, you know, a year ago, I did get the call from Richard Childress Racing and was very flattered, very honored to go to Talladega with Jeffrey Earnhardt, the black number 3 for Richard Childress Racing in the Xfinity Series, and do that. And we sat on the pole and finished second. And that kind of whet the appetite a little bit. There's no question. But the role of the crew chief has changed so much, because I spent about 2 weeks at Richard Childress Racing prior to that race, and everything is laid out. Everything is mapped out. Everything is engineered out, scienced out. I spent 2 or 3 days with the engineers, and they basically gave me how the car was set up. They gave me changes to make to the car if the car was doing this, if the car was doing this. And then I spent some time with the other engineers and the other crew chiefs up there. And it was laid out before we went down there. This is when we're going to pit throughout the race. And this is what we're going to do each pit stop. Now, it's a little different for Talladega because it's a super speedway. But I don't know that I could go back and be a crew chief. I think I could go back if there was such a thing. Indy cars actually have it, strategists, and call the race. But it would be cool to go back and do it again for Richard Childress Racing, considering that's where I finished up my crew chief career. And then also going back there and doing that Xfinity Series race a year ago at Talladega with them.
So how did you get your start in racing just in general? I mean,
pretty interesting story. So I was an only child, again, living in Birmingham, Alabama. My mom and dad, no interest whatsoever in racing, and really didn't come from any kind of a racing background. But my grandfather, my mom's dad, and my aunt, my mom's sister, who was really probably more like a sister to me because she was the baby of the family and she was only 10 years older than I was. The three of us, every Friday night, from pretty much mid-April till Labor Day, the local racetrack, Birmingham International Raceway, it was about a 15-minute walk down the hill. The three of us would go every Friday night and watch the local races. And then my aunt got married. Her husband was a race fan. So the four of us, every Friday night, very rare we missed a race. And my aunt was a little bit of a hot rodder. And I was still, I think, a junior in high school. And they started this brand new division called Street Stock Hobby. It was about as stock a race car as you could possibly think about building. The rules was about a one-pager. You took a car in a specific year and model. You took the windows out. You put a racing seat in it. You put the fuel tank up in the trunk. You were able to do a few things to the engine, put a number on the side, and you had a street stock hobby car. Well, the first night they started this division, my aunt looked at her husband and said, I'd like to do that, and I bet I could do it. So her husband, kind of tongue-in-cheek, said, okay, we'll go out and find you some sponsors, and we'll build you one. And so I think she called his bluff, probably more so because of being a woman in a man's sport. She went out and found more sponsors than we could almost put on the race car. So my racing career started in the basement of their house, building my aunt with my uncle, street stock hobby car. And I barely knew a 3/4 wrench from a 3/4 boat, but I had to learn quickly.
Me and JP talked with Dave Mader at Montgomery Motor Speedway a little while back, and he told us that he knew you when you were somewhat starting out, and he's the one that really put this all into motion of us talking to you. So,
yeah, I remember him reaching out to me. Dave Mader was a game changer in my racing career. I worked with my aunt, her little street stock hobby team for a couple of years. Not a lot of success. I don't know that she had a ton of talent, but obviously the budget was very limited. And after I graduated from high school, I went to work at a junkyard there in Birmingham, Charles Finley Auto Parts. And Charles sponsored a local late model team. The owner was Bobby Ray Jones there right out of Minor, Alabama, just outside Alabama. And so I went with Charles one night up to Nashville to watch them race. And a guy by the name of Richard Orton was driving for Bobby Ray at that point. And as we got up there, and I kind of just started kind of helping out a little bit. And that night when they were loading up, Bobby Ray looked at me and said, if you ever get tired of working on your aunt's car, you come on out there, we'll put you to work with our stuff. It's like, wow, it's pretty cool. So Monday, first thing Monday, I was out there, and of course, volunteer. You know, you didn't make money. It really probably to some degree cost you money. Well, that was, I think, 1977, and in 1978, Dave Mater started driving for Bobby Ray, and we won a ton of races. I mean, we won a lot of big races. We won the Snowball Derby in 1978 at Pensacola. We won a big race at Birmingham, big race at Montgomery. There's no telling how many regular shows we won at Birmingham, but Dave Mater, he still is, but he definitely was the man. He was quite the shoe.
So I believe, Steve, you have the next question.
Yes, sir. Who is the next up-and-coming driver that nobody's really paying attention to?
Oh, that's a great question. I can think of a few, and it's pretty ironic. There's about 3 of them that jump in my mind, and they all have the same last name, even though they're not kin. But Zane Smith, I definitely think somebody's going to be putting him in a Cup car next year. You know, he's won the Truck Series championship. He's already on track to maybe be a contender to win it this year. He's running a few Cup races this year. I think he's one we're going to be talking a lot about moving down the road. This Chandler Smith, that's in his first year at College Racing in the Xfinity Series, coming out of the Truck Series, drove for Kyle Busch Motorsports. I definitely think he's the real deal.
That's my boy.
Sammy Smith, driving for Joe Gibbs. Very, very little experience. Came almost straight out of the ARCA Series to drive that Xfinity car for Joe Gibbs Racing. He's already won a race at Phoenix. So I think about those 3 Smith boys, even though none of them are related. That's 3 that definitely has caught my eye and caught my eye early.
Yeah, I'm from the same town Chandler's from. Me and him actually grew up together. So
would that be Talking Rock, Georgia?
Yes, sir. That would be correct.
All right.
So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about your stories from being in Alabama and how, you know, the various drivers you've seen, but who would you say, as far as Alabama drivers, is your Mount Rushmore?
You know, I know he's from Hialeah, Florida. But, you know, he moved to Alabama at such an early part of his life and his career. It would have to be Bobby Allison. You know, Bobby now lives up here in the same area as I do. I see Bobby all the time. We go to the same Catholic church that Bobby goes to. You know, 83, 84 Cup wins, Cup championship, and NASCAR Hall of Famer. And the list just goes on and on. I would probably, I know he's originally from Hialeah, Florida, but they do call him part of the Alabama gang. So I would probably have to definitely say, without even thinking hard about it, Bobby Allison, obviously another driver that's close to my heart. Unfortunately, his career was cut very short, so he didn't get the wins and the championships that his dad got, but it would have to be Davey Allison at a pretty close second.
See, I mean, there's just so many drivers from Alabama I think are great drivers in the sport. I mean, Bobby Allison, Davey Allison, Donnie Allison, Red Farmer.
Yeah.
And that's just to name a few. I mean, it's.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's racing talent from everywhere, but it's unreal just from Alabama how many great racers there have been.
No, you're absolutely right. It's and most of them do have the last name Allison for sure.
So, JP,
do you have any do you have any stories about work?
Oh no!
No.
He froze.
Uh-oh.
Oh no!
No.
It wants to take over.
I'll ask his question for him. So growing up in Birmingham, you've already talked a little bit about it, but do you have any other stories growing up around the Birmingham area and just neat little things that you can tell us?
Well, again, Talladega opened in 1969, and I was only 10 years old. And as I said earlier, not really much interest in my family, especially my mom and my dad, as far as racing. But finally, in I want to say it was probably about 1974, 1975. I finally convinced my dad for him and I to go see a race at Talladega. And, again, I was about 13, 14 years old. And it was a race that was won by Dick Brooks, driving for some brothers out of Atlanta, Georgia. The only cup race that Dick ever won. But I remember the seats we got when we got there, convinced him, let's go pretty early. Let's see everything kind of going on. And again, I was not really involved in any kind of racing yet. This was before my aunt started street stock hobby racing. But I remember getting there, and our seats were perfect because could look across and see the garage Sunday morning, teams preparing the cars. Could see the early part of pit road, the entrance part of it where a lot of teams were pitting. And I guess I should have known right then where destiny was going to carry me because, yeah, don't get me wrong, I was intrigued about the racing throughout the day, but I was probably more intrigued by watching those teams prepare those cars over in the garage area on Sunday morning. I remember taking a pair of binoculars with me and looking through them and watching, Leonard Wood and Junior Johnson and Harry Hyde, just to name a few, and Bud Moore, and then seeing those teams go across that wall and pit that car. And I guess when I think about the timetable of me in Talladega, to go there, and again, 1974, 1975, my very first cup race as a fan of any kind anywhere, and then to go back there as a crew chief in the mid-'80s, and then to go back there finally in the spring of 1992 and win the race with Davey Allison, my home track, his home track. That was a pretty special win right there. And then, so a little side story about that 92 win, Linda, my wife, and our two oldest kids, my youngest was not born yet, but my two oldest kids, Brooke and Brandon, they were with me. So they got to go to Victory Lane. But now Brandon was just barely a year old. He was born in May of 91, and this was April or May of 92. So he got to go to Victory Lane. I'm sure he don't remember. Spinning ahead 20 years later, spring of 2012, Brandon wins the ARCA race at Talladega and drives a race car into Victory Lane. And that was pretty surreal to know that he was in that Victory Lane 20 years earlier in his mom's arms in a baby blanket, and 20 years later he drives a car in there as a winner of the race. That was a pretty surreal moment, no doubt.
See, the reason JP wanted to ask that question is he's from Birmingham, and I'm from Prattville, which is south a good ways, but just really like paying attention to the racing scene around the state and the history behind it. And that kind of brings me to the next question, which is, do you pay any attention to the current racing world in Alabama at the short tracks?
People will send me stuff, and I'll catch some stuff on some newsletters and stuff. I try, but probably not to the degree that I would like to, just because, unfortunately, God only puts so many hours in a day and so many days in a week. And trust me, I put 50 pounds in a 10-pound bag every day and pray it doesn't bust. Between what I do for Fox and for FS1, I co-host a radio show Monday through Friday on Sirius XM NASCAR Radio called On Track 11 to 1. So yeah, but I do, especially I think when we get toward the end of the season and some of those big races that I remember going back and we were a part of winning, like the Snowball Derby in Pensacola. So yeah, I do try as best I can pay a little bit of attention.
John?
All right, I'm going to ask this other one first. Where do you see the sport in 25 years when it'll be the time to celebrate NASCAR's 100th anniversary?
Yeah, because I guess I was here for NASCAR's 50th back in 1998. It was a big year. You know, that happened to be the year that we won the Daytona 500 with Dale. And I remember we were at the Fontana race. And back then, the Fontana race was not race number 2. It was like in the late April, early May, kind of about this time of year we're in right now. And all of the drivers and owners and crew chiefs, and we all took our wives. We went to a big event in Hollywood, and it was on Thursday night before the race weekend. And that's when NASCAR announced 50 greatest drivers. And it was pretty cool because there were so many drivers that I had worked with, that I had won races with, that was announced that night. You know, Davey Allison, Ernie Irvin, David Pearson that I worked with in the early 80s, Dale Jarrett, you know, just Dale Earnhardt. It was a lot of drivers that I had been a part of their careers was announced that night. But yeah, to see where we've come in the last 25 years, I wished I had a crystal ball that could really see year 100 really clearly. I hope I'm still here to see it, maybe enjoy it, maybe know what's going on. But I'll be on up in age by then because I'm 64 now. So the way I sit, I'll be 89 when that comes down. But hopefully I'm still here to enjoy it. But I would like to think that it will just continue to grow as it has over the last 8 to 10 years. You know, if you and I had a conversation about 15 years ago about where I thought NASCAR was headed, I'd have probably went, I don't know. I'm a little scared. I'm a little concerned. I felt like the leadership that we had was not good. That car of tomorrow ended up being the car of disaster. It about put us out of business. We weren't getting outside the box. We were just rinse and repeat with everything we did, whether it was the schedule, the tracks. We just weren't going anywhere. NASCAR was over officiating, drivers over officiating the whole sport. But I've got to say today, I feel pretty good about where we're at. You know, this is a pretty pivotal year for NASCAR because the negotiations are starting to happen with networks about the next TV contract. I mean, we still have one more year, 2024, but all the negotiating is going on as we speak. So I think that's going to be big as to if it is Fox and NBC that comes back. I think the group I work for is interested in coming back on board. You know, I guess it depends on if they feel like the value of it is the same that NASCAR feels the value of it. But hopefully we're continuing to do new and different things, just like what you've seen over the last several years.
I've loved the new tracks and stuff we've been to, and I love going back to North Wilkesboro for the All-Star race.
Well, you think about this year, 2 tracks we're going to, we're taking a huge step forward by going to the downtown streets of Chicago, but then we're taking a huge step back to the future by going to one of the most iconic little short tracks in the Carolinas, North Wilkesboro Speedway. So I love what we're doing right now. And that's not just a sales pitch. I truly believe that.
And it's kind of a 2-part question. From your perspective, what's the most intriguing thing about the next-gen car that you've seen?
I think it has equaled the playing field. If you go back to that old car, the Gen 6 car, there's so many teams that's competitive right now. There's so many teams that wouldn't even come close to winning races. That's won races over the last year and a half. And I think that's good for the sport. You know, it appears this year that the gap opened back up a little bit, and that's probably expected because when it came about last year, it was a clean sheet of paper for everybody. Hendrick Motorsports didn't have any kind of an upper hand over Front Row Motorsports. But I still see today, when you look at teams like Front Row Motorsports that's able to get those top 10 finishes like we see Michael McDowell, like we see Todd Gilliland, when you see Ricky Stenhouse Jr. driving for a single car team, JTD Daughtery Racing, and be able to win the Daytona 500, I think that's a pretty good sign. You see Chris Buescher driving for RFK Racing win the Bristol race last summer. And I think that's good. People get burnt out on the same people winning over and over and over and over. And now it seems to be spread around. It seems like the gap has opened up a little bit this year in year two, but it's still pretty darn competitive. I promise you right now, we're headed to Dover this weekend. I sat down and watched the Dover race from a year ago, a couple nights ago, and I could probably sit here and make a list of about 15 drivers that realistically I think could go up there and win this race on Sunday. Just it's the way the competition is right now.
And the second part of that is I listen to Denny's podcast, and he talks about how the less horsepower and the bigger tires are kind of a detrimental to the car. Do you think having more horsepower would actually help the car better with like passing at like super speedways in Martinsville?
I think some places we go, I do hope it's something NASCAR's looking at. We can't, we're at 510 horsepower at Daytona, Talladega, and Atlanta, and we're 670 everywhere else. We can't go much more than that at the Michigans, the Texas, the Charlottes, because we can't get back to these things going over 200 miles an hour going off the corner. I know racing is about speed, but we got to
about safety
on the ground too. But I think at basically all the tracks that they have deemed wet weather tracks, which is where they have went to the 2-inch tall rear spoiler. They've taken some front downforce away by removing the engine strakes. I think those tracks there, I don't know if we need to go all the way to just opening it up, but I think if we could get somewhere around 750, I think that would be good. But if that's something they're going to do, I've talked to Jeff Andrews with Hendrick Motorsports. I've talked to Doug Yates with Roush Yates. If that's something NASCAR is going to do, they got to do it pretty fast for 2024. I know the fan may think, well, how big a deal can that be? They just unbolt that one tapered spacer and put another tapered spacer on, or bigger. It's a lot more complicated than that, because these engine packages are designed and built around the horsepower. And you can't just take a 670 horsepower built engine and give it 80, 90 more horsepower, because the parts and pieces have to be a little bit different. So if that's something they're going to do, they're going to have to drop throw that switch pretty quick.
Well, I believe that's
about
everything. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and
Yes.
really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate you guys
Appreciate
having me, and see Dave made it around. Say hello to me, and hope you guys enjoy the rest of this 2023 season. It's a
good one so
a
far.
long way to go
Oh, yeah.
in the regular season, but I swear it seems like these things are coming about twice a week right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yep,
I'm ready for Darlington.
Yeah, same here.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2
Best
weeks.
track on the schedule.
Cannot come any faster. Cannot come any faster. Can't speak today.
But yeah, again, thank you for coming on, and we will show this tonight when we go live.
You got it. You guys take care and have a great
All right,
rest of
have
the
a
day.
good one.
Have a
You
good one,
too.
Larry.
Bye.
I still can't get over the fact that we talked to Larry McReynolds.
I mean, that was amazing. That was probably one of the best things I think I've ever done in my professional life. My grandparents are watching right now. Hi, Grandma. Hi, Grandpa.
I like how you completely missed the meme I was making on you.
I totally. What were you trying to do?
I said if you can call it professional.
Oh yeah, totally. 'Cause
Anyways,
we're professional on this podcast.
so that was it for story time with Larry Mack. Nothing else for this week. It's going to be a short episode. We, about 45 minutes, but this will be out on Spotify tonight. And thank you guys for watching, and we will see you next week.
See y'all next week. Remember, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Also, subscribe to our Spotify.
Yep. So anyways, see you guys then.
Have a good night.